Welcome back to the Rebel's Edge, where a lot of opportunities are created when people panic. And people definitely panicked on Friday and again today. And Pete and I are going to break it down for you on the Rebel's Edge. Bang!
Rock and roll, baby. Tell you what, did we have enough, John, did we have enough football over the last 4 or 5 days? I mean, I love it, but holy smokes, man, it's filling the airwaves.
Did we go 5 for 5? And the answer is yes.
We got close. Well, I don't know.
I think we did. Which one did we lose?
I thought the Chargers were going to take the Texans down or whatever, but
I don't even know if we talked about that one, Pete.
Yeah. Well, then we did okay, but I know I would have taken the Chargers.
Sports Extra.
That's right.
We hit Texas, Ohio State. We had Notre Dame, Georgia. Let's see. And then we went to pros. We had whatchamacallit, Pete, Baltimore over the Steelers.
For sure.
And I think you had adamantly pushed because of the running back for Philadelphia. You said, Green Bay can't stop him.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's 4 for 4. I don't know about the fifth one, but I think we were 4 for 4.
We might have covered it that way. I will say this. On that Fox 9 that I was on last week, they asked me about Green Bay. They said, what are the odds that Green Bay wins? I said 0. And they said, what? I said 0. I go, and that's not because I'm a Viking fan. I'm not a fan of anybody, really. I watch everybody, and I try to look at it the way I look at it. And I looked at Green Bay, and I'm like, well, Love looked pretty good most of the season, but not great, and was starting to slide a little bit. All he did was throw a bunch of picks.
and wasn't he banged up a little, Pete, into that game?
His elbow. He had the bad elbow, and so that was a problem for sure. They had a couple other injuries. I mean, if you looked at their injury chart, even during the game against Philly, it was awful. And you know what? When you got to get guys out there that are going to want to try to tackle Barkley, they better be ready, because they weren't ready.
Yeah, Shaquan was ready.
Yep.
All right, guys. Pete, let's dive into Macro Minute. And I'm going to say between Biden and the fires in LA, the world seems on fire. There's just stuff going on, people. And I'm not making light of the LA fires, not at all. I will remind people, though, that FEMA still hasn't done crap for the people in North Carolina. So, and in California, I feel for those folks, Pete, because, they depend on the fire department. It's not the fire department's fault when the hydrants don't have water.
Yeah.
And then they lie to us about it, about saying, oh, there's plenty of water. No, there wasn't. But anyway, we don't want to take more than a minute, so I'm going to end it with that, Pete. But the world is a little different today than it was a week ago.
Well, mine will be very quick anyway. It's earnings season again, John, and it really starts to kick off in a big way on Wednesday. And then we're going to hear from the financials, which will be very, very interesting. I think they're going to be very strong. We'll see when the time comes. And it's a big week for data for the Fed. That alone tells me it's a very big macro week.
Well, then you go right to futures, Pete. And futures, we could look at something like crude oil. President Biden apparently hates Americans, Pete, because nothing's going to change about the climate or anything else in these final days before that guy is gone. But what is happening right now? He throws a grenade into the room and he puts a ban or sanctions on 200 Russian tankers. Well, we don't get oil from Russia, but Europe still does. And a lot of places around the globe still do. So that puts a pretty big demand kink into the markets. And right now, our crude oil, WTI West Texas, 79, Pete. We were up limit in Singapore overnight, and this guy is gonna, go out with a bang, apparently.
It's been a strange week for that. There's no doubt about that, John. I'm going to just hit real quick that if we look at the 10-year, I look at two things that I think are the most important two things each and every single day. The 10-year, where is it? Well, it's at a 4.79. That isn't very good. It's not that too terribly far from the 52-week highs. I think the other thing is I bring up volatility all the time, I think for all the right reasons. We got up above 22 today, John. We've eased back a little bit closer to 20, but that volatility is definitely something that people should always take note of along with the 10-year. Those two combined, that'll tell you almost everything about the market.
Well, and how about this, Pete? Speaking of our market today, ITCI. So we kick off the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, which is going on as it does every year around this time. Johnson & Johnson decide, you know what, we're going to buy intracellular therapies. And I'm not claiming that we had the unusual activity up on our site, Pete, because it really wasn't the sort of volume you and I look for. But I will say that in the month of December, it averaged 57 contracts a day. And on Friday, it traded 1,500 contracts. So the fact that that's 30 times what the December volume was is interesting. Does it mean that somebody did insider trading? Maybe. Maybe they were just buying ahead of JP Morgan. What do you think, Pete?
Well, I think somebody probably figured that they knew a little something going on in this one, John. I mean, that alone, what you just said. But I'll tell you what, this Intracellular, it's an interesting company. You know, they got $1 billion of cash sitting on their balance sheet. That's pretty damned impressive. Anybody who's got that, when you're talking about that world of biotech and all of that, that's amazing. I'll tell you what, J&J stepping up to the plate with this one. A 35% premium is what they're paying for it, John. This is a massive move in the schizophrenia world and the bipolar world and all kinds of different treatments for depression and all the rest of it. They've got a really deep 5-drug phase 3 sitting right in front of it. So this is a company ready to really rock and roll over the next few months. I'm really impressed with this one. And you know what? This is why the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference is such a big deal. Things like this happen every year. And in this year, so far, it's Intracellular, but we might have another one as well, huh?
Well, we might, Pete, because Sage Therapeutics, SAGE, this one jumped 30%, then 35%. I looked just as we were going on air, Pete. It's up 40%. And the short interest in this one is double digits. So Pete always likes to note that, folks, because these are people that are losing money in a big way as the stock goes up. And why are they up? Well, because Biogen may have made an unsolicited offer, like Pete said. And as we learn more about it, maybe this one goes even higher.
Yeah, this is another one, you know, the shorts, to your point, John, that's standing pretty well with the 10%. That's a decent short. They've got great cash flow in this company. It's really pretty interesting. There's some cash burn, but they're sitting on $560 million of cash. So the cash flow itself, is it pulling out? It is pulling out to some degree, but this is one where this sort of meeting together with Biogen really makes this one that much more interesting. I think it's pretty wild to watch what they're doing. Again, this is depression. I mean, this must tell us a little something about the United States right now, John, and the rest of the world, that these kinds of stocks are the ones that people are going after right now. They've got one drug already in the market. They've got 4 that are sitting there ready and then being evaluated as we speak. There's a lot to this name, and Biogen making a pretty big move on this one. The possibilities of this acquisition, it's probably, I think they're looking at what, a little over $7 a share. This is another big move today in the biotech world.
Yep. And then, Pete, we can kind of stick with, I guess, healthcare. Yeah. Moderna, mRNA, and what do? Well, they were in the vaccine business. Vaccine business ain't so good anymore, Pete. And the shares were just plummeting. It's already traded 3 times the full session volume in the first few hours of trading today. They cut their revenue and guidance on slow demand for, guess what? COVID vaccines. Do you know anybody, Pete, that is out there clamoring for a COVID vaccine, by the way?
I don't know anybody who's clamoring for it, John, but, you know, it is kind of interesting. You know, you go into your local pharmacies, you know, the Walgreens of the world, and they've all got it set up. I don't see anybody getting it. And that's probably the biggest part of the problem. They did cut that revenue guidance, as you said, for 2025. That's a bit of an issue. The disappointment of this guide is certainly what people are looking at right now going, well, wait a minute. It's weird because it's not the only thing that Moderna does, and they do have a great balance sheet. But that all being said, it hit a 52-week low today. It got underneath $32 a share, John. The high is 170. There's heavy volume trading in this one. It's very, very interesting to see how what was at one point in time one of those media darlings, this thing has gotten flushed down the toilet for the right reasons, because a lot of people think it's a pile of what. They do have a great balance sheet. They've got all the money that they need, but they've got to start focusing on something other than just trying to get into this part of the vaccine world.
Well, Pete, and I'm not hanging this loss on Steve Weiss, but Stephen Weiss loved this company forever. And that's not to say that he wasn't right. He was right in 2021. The stock ran from 100 to nearly $500 a share. That same stock, just like Pete said, folks, is $33 today. So did they have fabulous technology? Maybe. And were people forced to take the vaccine? Yes. And if supply and demand are still viable catalysts for up or downward movement in the market, they were demand for the upside, and now their lack of demand moves that stock down.
Yep.
And to Pete's point, they are real medicine, but they don't have the government forcing people to take their medicine anymore. All right, let's take a look at ANF, Abercrombie and Fitch, because Abercrombie set a record for the holiday season. But guess what? They also gave an upside for 2025, if you will. We'll call it a projection. And it wasn't as great as people had hoped, because the stock immediately started getting hit, Pete. And it hasn't really stopped getting hit, has it?
No. And, it's interesting, John, though, because when you sort of dig into this whole thing, it doesn't look all that terrible. As a matter of fact, they exceeded expectations, right? They had a record holiday season for themselves. Their forecast was strong for 2025. They got a PE of 13. The margins are 65%, free cash flow of just under $500 million, and they're selling the thing. And by the way, there are some shorts out there that definitely don't think that highly of Abercrombie. They're anywhere between 8 and 14%. But the stock is sort of sitting right in the middle, John. If you look at the 52-week low and high, it's 95 to 195. Here it is at what, 130, 131, something close to that. I mean, everywhere I look at this thing, I kind of scratch my head going, they seem like they're doing pretty well. What's the problem? I would keep a close eye on this one, John. At some point, it doesn't seem like it's that awful. Now, there's something that somebody's out there definitely pressing on it right now, and they're pressing on it pretty hard, and that's what's pushing this stock down 18% today. But I don't know. I'm kind of curious on watching this one. If I see some UOA, unusual option activity, that's one where I would say, you know what? There it is. Maybe it's time to turn, and I'd probably participate in that.
Low was like $95 in the last year. So I don't think we see that, Pete. And I don't disagree with you that if the stars align, I think you could go after this one in that 120 to 130 range. And it's on the higher end of that range right now. But if you're somebody who averages in other words, if you're somebody who buys a little now and holds back with the other 50% and tries to get in at a better price, I don't disagree. I think you might have a pretty good stock to watch for the next quarter easily.
Yeah.
Well, what do you got for sports, Pete? Are you going to give us another Saquon Barkley-esque investment for the Vikings-Rams game, or what are you going to do?
Well, as you said, John, we really did that pretty well last Thursday when we decided, even though the market was closed, we would just do an all-sports thing, and it turned out pretty daggone well, I think, and we were pretty solid across the board. I would say this. Here's what I want to tell everybody. When you look at wild card weekend, right? We've had this in front of us. We still have the Vikings tonight for Monday Night Football, but the Broncos. Now, the Broncos got their opening drive. They go right down the field. They score some points. They put up 7. They never scored anything after that, John. They lose 31-7. Here's the interesting part. They can't run the football. Bo Nix really didn't get much help. And by the way, they ran 42 plays in this game to the 72 plays that Josh Allen was able to put together. And the running of Josh Allen, the running of the Buffalo Bills, that's what killed them. And that's going to be the theme that I'm going to go with, because we look at the Baltimore Ravens playing the Steelers, right? Steelers, people are pretty excited. We all love Tomlin. He is a great coach. I think a lot of people very much like him. I do. But I'll tell you this, give me Harbaugh and give me Derek, okay? I mean, if you want to get a guy who's going to run the football and you get the Ravens and you run for 300 yards on your opponent, John, you're probably going to have a pretty good day, I would say. And Derrick Henry only put up 186 yards yesterday running the football. Pittsburgh put up 29. So it's showing, I think, something that I've said about these GMs in the NFL. They're all a bunch of idiots, except for Baltimore, Philadelphia. I almost might even slide Minnesota in there because they went out and they picked up a running back who's pretty good from Green Bay, their rival.
I'd throw Detroit in there.
Absolutely. I mean, what did they do? Let's see. Everybody who goes for receivers except for Detroit, they go and get Jamar Gibbs in the first round. Well, turns out that he might not be such a bad running back, huh? And his sidekick, Montgomery. I mean, when you look at them, how do they do it? They run the ball. They run the ball to give themselves the opportunity to throw the ball. And that was something that's gotten lost in the last 6 or 8 years of the NFL, John. How about Green Bay, Philly? I don't know. Shaquan goes out there and, he runs. He does okay. As a team, they run for 170 yards, John. Barkley, I can't even remember how many he had, but I know he got over 100 yards himself. So that's what I'm looking at right now. So I'd say this. With the Viking game tonight, it's going to be very tight, in my opinion. You've got Matthew Stafford over here, and you've got a very young quarterback in terms of what experience he's had. So you've got that going on, but you've got 2 very good running backs on each of these 2 teams. So I think it's going to be close. The Rams beat the Vikings pretty solidly in week 5, I think it was, when they played each other. But I think it's going to be a pretty close game. I think it's going to end up moving a little bit more for the Vikings, only because, John, if they're leaving because of the fires, which are horrific, and we know that, and they go to Arizona, where does the entire state of Minnesota go when it's time for the winter time to come? They want to get into the sun. They want to get away from the snow. The snowbirds are out. They go to Florida, but they really go to Arizona. That's going to be a Viking stadium, I think, tonight.
I think you're right, because so many snowbirds, as they're known, Pete, go to Florida. If they're from the Midwest, they go to the west side of Florida, Tampa, Sarasota, and so forth. And if they're from the East, generally, these are generalizations, they go to everything from Vero Beach all the way down to Miami. And that's just kind of the way it shakes out. From Minnesota, a lot of them go to Phoenix. So you're right. I think that will be, it will negate the edge that the Rams had as far as home field advantage. And I think your point, Pete, is so well taken. It's why Pete will probably be an NFL GM someday, folks, because when he talks about Shaquan Barkley, or he talks about the King over there at Baltimore, when you're talking about teams that run the ball, and I'm putting Detroit in here, Pete, because all Laporta did, and that's another tight end out of Iowa, folks. Again, we've talked about him all year, but he set an NFL record for the first 2 seasons in the NFL. He had 144 receptions. How does that happen? Well, he's a great athlete. He gets open, but also if you're slamming the ball in with Montgomery and Gibbs and all these guys that the Lions can put in the backfield, the linebackers have to cheat up. It always happens. And when that happens, you get a seam open for the tight end, and the tight end gets catches. A lot of teams don't take advantage of that, Pete. But I know that the Baltimore Ravens have in the past. Is it Andrews, Pete? Is that their tight end? Okay. Another great tight end. Tight ends become great because running backs are great. Wide receivers don't create great opportunities necessarily for running backs, especially if the O coordinator decides to try to target them like 12 times a game.
Yep.
Because as Pete just said, that would be 1/4 of all of the plays that some of these teams like, the Broncos run. So I think it's really important to pound the ball with the running backs, but not every play, of course. And that opens it up for the receivers, tight ends first, wide receivers, and slots second.
What I wanted to jump to next, John, is we've got it right in front of us now. We've been watching the NCAA playoffs. It's been absolutely phenomenal. You take a look at all these games, a lot of really good games. As a matter of fact, I thought there was a couple of nuggets that I wanted to throw out there, John. So you got the 12 team. This is the first year of doing it. Now, these guys who want to go to 16 are idiots. We don't need 16. 12 was fine. They keep wanting to get bigger, and everybody says, well, it's like basketball. They got 64. It's a different deal. It's a different sport. You don't want to do that to these players. It's too many games, I think, for college. But I would say this. How about this? The 4 teams that had byes were all eliminated. So that's one thing, getting into the quarterfinals. The top 4 ranked were all eliminated, the top 4, obviously the bye teams. And then all of a sudden you start getting a little bit further and a little bit further. Ohio State ends up beating Texas, right? 28-14. Why did they do that? Well, there was a strip sack. They were moving down the field. They were ready to get a little bit closer and a little bit closer to score and get this game, to get a pretty interesting game going. And what happens? All of a sudden, Jack Sawyer comes in. He comes in, gets the strip sack, runs the thing back, and that game is essentially over because of that. Then you've got Notre Dame and Penn State. Got a great quarterback with Alar. He gets out there, throws something that he doesn't do. He throws a poor pass. It's intercepted, and they lose to Notre Dame. And it's going to be a really interesting game, John. I know that everybody is leaning towards Ohio State, and I understand it because they have talent absolutely everywhere on that team. But there's something about what Notre Dame is doing and how I think they look like they are destined for something. Now, I'm not positive I think they win yet, although we'll get to that at some point, maybe later in the week. But it sure is interesting to see what they've been able to do, what Marcus Freeman is doing, and all the prayer and all these other things that go into what they're doing. The one thing that I'll point out that nobody really talked enough about, John, was Riley Leonard, the quarterback from Notre Dame, got hurt. And they were concerned about this guy, maybe even, concussion protocol. They did all that type of stuff. So they run in their second string quarterback. All he does is go down the field. He goes 6 for 7. He throws for 44 yards. They get a field goal. They put some points on the board. I think that was the turning point in the game, actually, that the backup quarterback was able to move him downfield, played perfectly, and put them in a position that Riley Leonard comes back. He's a great dual threat quarterback, John, and he did what he needed to do in the second half of that football game. I'll tell you what, Notre Dame just feels destined, but Ohio State is absolutely loaded. What do you think about this one early? And we can change our minds when it comes around right before the game.
Early on, I like Ohio State, but I don't like them as big as some people do, Pete.
Yep.
I also remember when Notre Dame used to not go after players. In my day, Pete, I think they picked up one player from junior college. Now, this Riley Leonard that you're talking about was a Duke guy, right?
Yep.
So, that's not to say that the coach isn't doing a great job. I think he is. And I think you've got to recognize the opportunities that the portal gives you. Because like you've said, Pete, the portal is like the free agency in the NFL. And NIL is like the salaries in the NFL. It's very similar. And I think in the coming years, you're going to see a lot more crossover with college and pro coaches, because it had been sort of an unwritten rule that even great coaches like Pete Carroll at the collegiate level couldn't do it at pro. And then, of course, he proved him wrong after making a couple mistakes in the pros. He went out to USC, crushed it, and then went up to Seattle and won a Super Bowl. So obviously, coaches can do that. I don't think Urban Meyer is in that category, but there's a lot of good coaches that can go either side. We'll see whether or not, Pete, your guy Belichick can really change things at North Carolina. They're not a bad program. North Carolina isn't, but I don't know if he's the answer. We'll have to see how long he's been away from kids that are, he's had to deal with a few of those kids at the pro level. Now he's going to deal with all of those kids, no veterans, just kids.
Well, it's an interesting thing too, John. When I look at Belichick, the one thing that I sort of the reasoning that I have is that it's almost pro football now, right? As you said, you got NIL. Well, you've got the big money, and you've got the salary cap in the NFL. And I want to push back on one of the guys on Twitter, John, who came at me. I said, they've got to fix this whole thing with NIL, and I said they've got to figure out a cap. And some guy goes, oh, you want to keep money away from these guys? That's a bullshit, and he went after me on that. And I'm like, okay, buddy, just so you understand, the NFL does have a cap. What is the most successful league there is in the world right now? Probably the NFL. I mean, you look at the numbers, they're off the charts. The NBA can't compete. The NHL can't compete. MLB, not even close to competing. And it's the NFL. But the reason is, they've got a cap in place, which actually holds down from those that have all the money and want to spend all the money and those that don't. And it's all based upon the TV contract, right? I mean, so it makes total sense to me. Why don't they have a cap with this NIL? They need to do it, and they need to do it very quickly, John, because it will give the opportunity for the Minnesotas, maybe the Iowas of the world, to be able to compete with Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, the schools that have all that money. I mean, to me, it just makes common sense that maybe it's 20 million, maybe it's 25 million. Just have a cap. It doesn't even mean you have to get the whole cap, right? I mean, but if you've got that ability, then I think that makes sense. And I think that makes it far more fair for all the different schools to compete with one another. Otherwise, it's just the big get bigger, and that's the end of it.
Yeah, I tend to say that it's not a question of saying let's deprive these guys of the money that they are due. They fill the stadiums. The coaches don't fill the stadiums. Right. The players fill the stadiums. Now, the coaches got to do the right thing. And Ryan Day, to your point in the past, Pete, had failed pretty miserably against Michigan 4 times. Against Michigan, he hasn't been able to beat them. But the players on the field got to play. You got to put them in the right positions. They've got to understand what that team does against them and what they're going to do against that team. That's the coaching. Yeah. But the players got to play. And do they deserve the money? I think they do. Do they deserve an unlimited amount of it just because Texas has a bunch of oil money because Biden's going to drive crude oil to 100 a barrel before he gets out of office? I hope not. But we are seeing a very high surge in that crude oil price, folks. Yeah. And you can hang that solidly on the interns that are calling the shots, because I don't think Joe Biden is.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
Fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Make sure you join us tomorrow, folks, at 1 p.m. Make sure you check out right down there the Rebel Con out in Vegas. We'll be out there with our pal Grant Cardone and a whole bunch of luminaries. I hope you can join us. You can scan that QR code. It'll take you right to this page to register and grab your tickets, because March 22nd is coming around faster than you think. Thank you. Have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time.